It's a small group today, and I really want to take you into my confidence again, because I have a bit of a dilemma, and I will share my dilemma with you. And then once I've shared my dilemma, I will explain it. And then I want to have a discussion with you about what to do. The dilemma is as follows. In the media in Europe and in North America, there is an emerging pattern of comment about COVID-19, which is fundamentally one that is optimistic. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We should be able to get schools going again in Britain at any rate next month at some point. We can start perhaps thinking about summer holidays. Life will get back to normal in 2021. That's a sort of the narrative. It's the optimistic narrative, the kind of we've done it, and there's a little competition between countries on who's rolling out vaccines quicker than who else, a bit of we're doing it faster than you type talk. But it's all saying vaccination out everywhere, job done. Back to normal, go and watch football again, go to music festival again, and so on. Now there's an alternative narrative, and that is as follows. This pandemic is still moving quite fast across the world. There's still nearly 500,000 cases of COVID being reported every day. There's still a lot of people dying. In certain parts of the world, the numbers are climbing. Latin America, Africa, parts of Eastern Europe. There's not enough vaccine to go around at the moment, and there's no clear, equitable distribution of vaccine. There's a lot of variants around already, and there's more variants on the way. Those variants look like they're capable of escaping from the vaccines, the antibodies that the vaccines are creating in people. As the variants come on board more, perhaps people who've already had the original COVID will get infected by the variants. Perhaps the immunity won't protect them. It's likely to mean that the virus is going to stay with us for the foreseeable future, mutating away, and that the world is going to face quite a constant, one could say, battle or struggle to keep ahead of the virus, especially because the virus will go on mutating and some of these mutants would be quite nasty. And in the meantime, long COVID still affects 1 in 20 people with the disease and is having a major impact on societies. And that's what I call the realistic view. It's not optimistic, but it's not actually pessimistic, because it's the realistic view of what happens when new viruses arrive. And my dilemma is as follows. If I'm talking to a public group, if I'm talking on the media, if I'm talking to a business that wants advice, do I present the optimistic scenario, or do I present the realistic scenario? In the knowledge that there are some people who get very, very angry if we're not optimistic at the moment, and there are really worries about over-optimism in some quarters. But there are also some people who are saying if you're not realistic, you're not being fair to the world. You've got to actually tell it like it is. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts. And just to help us get in there, just to how I'm going to structure things today, I'm going to start with talking about what is happening right now in terms of data that we have on the disease, in terms of variants, and in terms of vaccinations. I'm going to talk about capacity to respond, the various what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions that people are using, the public health responses that we're seeing around the world, what's happening at borders, what's happening with treatments that are coming on stream, and what's happening with vaccinations. And then I'm going to tell you which way I think the world is likely to go in. I'm going to share with you the lessons that we've had so far, that we've gone through a lot in these briefings up till now. And then I'm going to focus a bit on actions that I think we should take. It'll be quite factual. Yes, there are political undertones and overtones to it, but I want to be factual, and I want you to join with me and debate with me. And by the way, I can't look at everybody who's on, so I don't know who's on, but if you are needing to intervene, I need to see you move around or twee. You happen to be, if you don't turn your video off, you're in the window just underneath me and Miles is next to you, and I can see you moving quite easily. I know where to look. Good. So the situation at the moment is that in Western Europe and in the US, the reported numbers of new cases are coming down, and they've been coming down for the last 3 weeks. And it's a really nice decline. It's not dramatic everywhere, but it's a decline. And the numbers of people in hospital with COVID is starting to decline, but the death rates are still quite high. And that's the expected lag. You usually have a lag of about 2 or 3 weeks between numbers of cases and numbers of deaths. So that is expected, the pattern that I've told you. And Western Europe is, in general, looking a lot better. Not everywhere, but in general. And the US is looking better. Canada is looking better. Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, other Latin American countries, not unfortunately so good. Brazil is particularly heavy right now with the big oxygen shortage in Amazonas, and Mexico not so good. And so Latin America is still quite active with COVID. Africa, I mentioned last week, but I'm going to say it again. West Africa, Senegal, Mali, and Southern Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, very, very heavy right now. Numbers not clear, but reports of major death in very precise geographical areas, which is what we tend to see with infectious diseases. They're coming through thick and fast. And the numbers in East Africa are rising as well. Asia, India is very much slowing down, and that's rather remarkable and good. Pakistan the same, and Nepal the same, but Indonesia still quite high, Malaysia high. And then going into Russia and Eastern Europe, numbers are still quite strong. Overall, mixed picture, some reduction in Western Europe and the US, but the rest still blowing quite hot. The current feeling is that the reason why the numbers in Western Europe and the US are coming down is that much of Western Europe, movement-wise, is in standstill, with huge economic and societal impact. And so what we're seeing is a result of the efforts to reduce contacts between people by limiting population movement. Now, if, as we suspect in some of the countries in Western Europe, there is over the next 2 or 3 weeks a relaxation, there will be more people meeting each other. 3-4 weeks later, numbers will go up again. We will get another surge, almost certainly in April, because there will be a general loosening in the next 2 to 3 weeks. The US, it's not clear to me why the US numbers have got rather a lot better quite quickly. There are various hypotheses about what's going on, but the absolute overload of US hospitals seems to be reducing. We just have to watch to see that's really happening. So in summary, this virus is still causing a lot of disease, a lot of death. The distribution across the world seems to have slightly changed. At the same time as the virus has continued to cause problems, we must remember that there are major mutations of the virus underway. And I told you last time, but I'll repeat it now, there are a number of variants of concern. We start with the variant in the UK, reported from Southeast England, but it may not have originated in the UK. It's actually in more than 50 countries now, sometimes called the UK variant. More easily transmissible, possibly more severe in terms of disease, not sure, but very definitely active and responsible for a considerable increase and spike in cases in the UK in January. Now, it was reported a few days ago that there has been a further mutation in some UK strain patients that has led to a further variant on the UK pattern, which has got some similarities to the South Africa strain, i.e. made it perhaps a little bit more resistant to the antibodies produced by the vaccine. So we've got a UK variant derivative that has emerged that is a cause of concern. Then there's a variant in South Africa that's responsible for the increase in cases in Zimbabwe and Zambia and Mozambique. And that one is more transmissible and is less responsive to most of the current vaccines than the original virus. And then in Brazil, there's a variant that's causing quite a lot of trouble around Manaus in Amazonas. There's reported to be 2 other Brazilian variants. And there are more variant reports coming in all the time. In fact, I've heard that there are 4,000 variants that are known. And the issue is not so much whether a variant exists, it's whether or not it is epidemiologically significant. The reason why I want to talk about the variants is that what it means is it's showing us that this virus is constantly changing, that it's capable of adapting around what's called the spike protein, which is part of the virus that sticks into the host. And that means that it's not really feasible to think of it in terms of getting rid of one virus. One has to be in a position to be able to resist and perhaps get rid of a number of different variations of that virus. And that's quite challenging for the vaccination program, because some of these variations of the virus will actually be able to beat or escape from the vaccines. The variants are a fact of life. They're here and they're not going to go away. On vaccinations, I've told you that we've been struggling to try to get the COVAX scheme, which is the scheme that's available for all countries, and there's about 95 countries that are eligible for cheap or highly subsidized vaccines through COVAX. There's a number of other countries who are invited to benefit from the bulk purchasing capacity of COVAX and get vaccines cheaper than they will get them on the open market. And I mentioned to you last week that there are a few issues with getting this COVAX scheme to work properly, particularly getting enough vaccine coming through and getting enough money to pay for those vaccines to get to developing countries. Well, last weekend, the WHO, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, and then other organizations, CEPI, agreed the preliminary distribution of vaccines to countries and started to lay out their expected supplies over the next 6 months. The only difficulty with that is that the supply planning is hugely dependent on whether or not the vaccines will come through from the manufacturers. And there are 2 reasons to doubt whether or not the delivery schedules will be kept. One is that these are biological products and the assembly lines go wrong. And there is at least one quite high profile account of a vaccine production plant having to close down or reduce production. And the second reason why the whole process can get muddled is that sometimes the companies find that they've got more than one contract for the same amount of vaccine, i.e. the product has been sold more than once. That's usually accidental, but it does mean that it's sometimes quite hard to be able to say, well, we promise you 500 million doses of our vaccine on a particular date, but it's hard to actually deliver on that promise because there is such a lot of competition for supplies. So either way, this COVAX scheme, which could be so brilliant for the world, it's there and it's working. It's got brilliant people running it, but it's probably just not able to do all the things that countries wanted to do because there's so many people trying to get hold of the vaccine for their own political purposes. But the vaccinations will become more available. It will be, unfortunately, some time before they're widely available in poorer countries. And they should be really helpful in reducing the risk for people who are most exposed, like healthcare workers, or people who are most at risk, like older people. We got, I think, some improvement in the information about vaccines coming through to the World Health Organization. There are dossiers now that are coming through on the other RNA vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, also the dossiers on the Chinese vaccine made by Sinopharm. That's come to the World Health Organization. There's more information coming available about AstraZeneca. That's a very important one because there's controversy about what is the right upper age range for the use of that vaccine. And we are waiting for full details of the Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5 from Gamaleya Laboratories. But the data are beginning to come in, and that's absolutely essential because the only vaccines that can be made available through COVAX are those that have got a formal emergency authorization from the WHO. So the vaccine story is not yet comfortable. The variant story is a bit alarming. The pandemic is still expanding. So what do we do? Answer, don't give up on the physical distancing and face masking. That's the best way to avoid getting this virus. Make certain that you have got a functioning system for testing, isolation, contact tracing, treatment, and then isolation of the contacts. Make sure you've got that system working because that is key to interrupting transmission, whether you have a vaccinated population or not. You must break the chains of transmission. If you haven't got that in place, then you're lacking your basics. I keep saying to people, concentrate on the public health measures. Make sure your public know what they've got to do. Then you can think about extra things like closing your borders. But there's not a lot of point in closing borders if you haven't got the transmission interruption in place. Actually, what we mean by closing borders is you just get information where people have come from. You try to make sure they quarantine. But I think the one thing that we're learning is that you actually, if you're going to isolate people, you isolate them in a managed way rather than just sending them off to do it on their own. Because if they do it on their own, they don't always have the incentive to do it properly. We've got hospital care improving. It's got a lot better recently. The survival rates have improved. People have been kept out of intensive care units more effectively. Once they get into intensive care units, it's a very high death rate. And so I'm actually thinking that care, medical care, is getting better and better. And more people are recovering. And I think that in general, therefore, if we could really focus on doing the greatest possible effort on the things we know how to do, that would help get death rates down. That would help get the spread down. Just say that in many countries, there is now a dilemma and it's as follows. Do we release our controls now when we got the numbers starting to come down because people are getting very frustrated and there's a big economic cost? Or do we wait a bit until our numbers are right down at zero and then release controls when we're right down at zero? Well, I just say don't release controls if you have not got a proper test, trace, treat, and isolate system in place. If you release controls without a good test, trace, treat, isolate system, your numbers will just go rocketing back up. And so I'm saying, make sure you've got the public health working. I'm also saying if you release controls, do an absolutely massive public relations campaign, making it clear to people that even if controls are released, they've got to go on practicing the basic preventive measures that I just described of distancing, masking, hygiene, and self-isolation or isolation when ill. So do everything possible not to be in a position where you are somehow forced by political expediency or by need to have to release controls quickly, because it will go wrong. I'm also saying, be careful. Your overall aggregate number might be plateauing as it is in France or coming down as it has been in the UK. But remember, that's just an overall cumulative figure. It's not telling you what's going on in different places. And just because you've got a nice flat curve for France, it doesn't mean that everywhere in France is in the same place. There will be some parts of France where you've got very rapid transmission underway. Other places where there's very little. Remember, these are just averages. And so I'm trying to say to everybody, just because your country's number looks nice and flat, that doesn't mean you haven't got rapid growth taking place in some parts of the country. And that rapid growth could easily turn into a big outbreak. So I'm trying to encourage everybody to recognize that if there is COVID in the country, you can be pretty certain that in some places the spread will be fast. And you don't want that spread to build up and build up and build up, and suddenly you have an explosive outbreak after 2 or 3 weeks, because then you've just gone really back in your response. You want to keep on the front foot, keep pushing this virus out. So that means really getting that testing, case finding, testing, contact tracing, treating and isolating routine in place is so important. And I want to add that protecting your most vulnerable citizens. Got to have that in place. I suppose, I am just becoming a boring, broken record saying, unless you've got these public health capacities in place, you're going to have a big shock with a nasty explosive COVID suddenly coming up that you haven't noticed. And then it will all be so bad. And of course, you really want to try to keep up the discipline, to get the numbers down, to maintain movement restrictions. It's just that in many of our countries at the moment, there's such impatience with the use of these restrictions, and it's creating such a lot of bad blood that I think it's kind of inevitable that countries will end up releasing before they really should. And I think last point on that is you have to work to get on top of this disease. If you get casual, if you get careless, it will come along and dominate. Much of the current surging that we've got in Europe is because during the autumn months of last year in 2020, governments just did not manage to put in place the rigorous and robust test, trace, treat, isolate, protect system that was so needed. So in conclusion, I want to ask all governments to maintain a relentless focus on interrupting transmission, finding cases quicker, doing it in a more comprehensive way, helping them to isolate, and absolutely making certain that contact tracing is at the highest possible quality. So that means test, trace, treat, isolate, protect at the local level, well-functioning, really efficient, short time lags, a system that works, for me is the most important thing for the next few months. Just because you've got a vaccine, it doesn't mean you don't need it. Secondly, we've got vaccine, we must preserve it for those who need it the most. That's the world's health workers, and do everything we can to resist the temptation to have it brought up by the rich countries and used to try to immunize all their population. No, give it to the world's health workers first. Leaving some people out basically harms the world. It creates a fertile ground for new variants. And quite honestly, in my opinion, it's wrong to have a massive global inequity in vaccines. But at the same time, I'm quite careful that I don't just go on saying that and saying that and saying that without coming up with a solution. And so that's where my efforts to try to persuade those that I know that are in contact with the G7 to make certain that the group of 7 rich nations actually does focus on the whole problem of vaccine equity as a matter of priority. Because we've got variants coming along, we've got all sorts of challenges about vaccine access. We need to deal with vaccines on a global, worldwide basis and do much, much more to make sure that we've got a good support system for situations where there are people who get sick or dying after a vaccine. We're going to help them. We've got to help people who get reinfected after they've been vaccinated. We've got to help with decision-making about what's the right interval of between vaccine doses and so on. We've got to get this vaccine side well and truly working and right. And in order to get there, we have to have a global approach. So my final point is that I'm continuing to argue for a global COVID immunization program, or currently acronym GCIP, because actually this is a really serious disease. None of us is safe until we're all safe, to quote Jeremy Farrar, the head of the Wellcome Trust. And we really have to make certain that we work hard for vaccine equity. And without that, it will be very difficult. So I've given you a brief introduction on what we know about the COVID outbreak as it stands at the moment, a brief remark on our capacity to respond, a bit about the history, a bit about the actions that have to be taken. So I come to my dilemma, which is, do I say, hey, everybody, it's good news, there's light at the end of the tunnel, we just got to get vaccinated? And secondly, is that a question of, am I telling it like it is, like I see it, and saying this virus is going to be around forever? So you've got a poll in front of you. I need your advice. Do I tell it like it is, Mr. Realistic, or do I join the optimistic chorus, which would be better for the world's mood, which is to say that as we get the vaccine rolled out, this thing is going to go away and we'll all be fine? I'd be interested to know your reactions. For me, it's not an easy question. The poll is up there on your screens. While I'm talking about that, I just want to say a couple of words about some of the things that we're all involved in. We've got an interesting session on Sunday, a thing on Sky News in the UK, but I think it's international, called Sophie Ridge on Sunday. And the reason why I'm asking for this question to be answered is that, assuming that program goes on, I think I will have to take notice of your suggestions here when I decide what position I'm going to take. But just to, somebody who's on the call wrote me a note the other day, and I just want to read you a couple of extracts of this note. Okay, thank you, Patrick Wilson. The politics and the economics of a variety of variants, says the correspondent, needs careful thought. In the UK, the focus is currently on the South Africa variant with the questions: can it can its spread be controlled by area targeted testing? And how susceptible to either acquired immunity or the vaccines is it? And of course, there are linear answers to those questions. And right now, the general view expressed by decision makers in Parliament is that area targeted testing should make it possible to control spread. It'll be pretty heroic if it works. And the general feeling is that it should be susceptible either to acquired immunity to the original virus or to the vaccines currently available. But it's interesting that the way in which it's being presented is not with hard, clear things. It's a little bit uncertain. But my correspondent says the idea that the Brazilian and other variants that are yet to emerge will continue to complicate the public health picture and prevent a return to normal has not yet become common knowledge. The implications of a continuing virus in terms of continuing restrictions on personal and commercial activity with consequential political and economic challenges are certainly not widely understood. Now you'll get few prizes, says my correspondent, for being correct about what will be seen as a pessimistic prediction at a time when the audience is looking for positives. But you're probably going to have to tell it like it is. Because in the end, unless we as a society can get ahead of it and keep ahead of it and be clever enough to find the right ways to keep ahead of it, possibly with annual vaccination top-ups, unless we can do that, the recovery of business confidence is going to be so difficult. And the future of life for all of us is going to be difficult too. So we must focus on a long-term response strategy, a long-term global program. Okay, thanks very much indeed. Twee, can we go over to the middle part and see how it goes? And then we'll come back to the discussion.
Sure, and just quickly, I'll spotlight the illustration. Sally Pring, welcome back. I know you joined us last November, so lovely to see you back again. I'll also share the results of the poll. Now, of course, the answer is not one or the other, but it's very useful for us here and for David to understand at least which direction the wind is blowing. And I think it's quite clear looking at those results, with 96% of you saying to tell it like it is. So over to the other poll that I had planned. We have 3 questions. So the first one there is on public health history and related to the Africa Centers for Disease Control. So please select which of these 3 events you think sparked the establishment of the Africa CDC. Question 2, based on the World Health Organization case report forms to date, which percentage of COVID-19 cases can be attributed to healthcare workers at the moment? Now, those are the case report forms submitted to the WHO by countries, and to date, they've got over 37 million forms from 183 countries. And question 3, what do you miss the most at the moment? And you can select more than one here. This is about you. And while those answers are coming through, I'll give you a minute. And I might end in 3, 2, 1. So the answer, so for number 1, on which events sparked the establishment of the Africa Centers for Disease Control, it was in fact Ebola virus disease outbreak of 2014, which means that it is a very recent entity and quite surprising, but really good to know that it's there, and quite impressive how quickly the funds were mobilized to get it up and running. So very recent and quite surprising. On number 2, on health workers, yes, great, thanks for shouting out to the health workers earlier. This year is the designated International Year of Health and Care Workers, and the answer is 8% based on the reported cases so far. Now, that's just based on what's been reported, and it's actually improved slightly. So from the first 3 months of the pandemic, it was at 10%. Then it dropped to 5% in early June, and then 2.5% in September. So that's become much, much better recently because of better training, access to PPE, and increased knowledge about transmission. But of course, there are many gaps in understanding the transmission with health workers. So WHO has launched a new surveillance protocol for health workers, and more countries are signing up to that, which is great news. And then lastly, what did you miss? What are you missing the most? Going to dinner with friends is the one you miss the most. So just to share a little insight, Catherine, one of our team members here, what she does is she arranges evenings where her and a couple of her girlfriends all agree to eat the same meal, and they sit at the table and they're on Zoom and they enjoy their meal all together. For the other examples, just for your info, for cycling around new sites, I know at least one colleague, John Atkinson, has an application which allows him to cycle around different places around the world from home. Going to the movies, you can make this an event at home, buy some popcorn. And then the last one, going to the office to work. There is some studies at the moment that it's really positive for your mental health to have this fake commute, for example, where you get up, you get ready, you walk around the block as if you're going to work, and then you start work. And that's a study's come out and says that that's really positive for you. So that's the end of the poll. Back over to you, David, for our question and answer session.
There's a comment in to you from Vicky Doyle saying, could we have more singing and dancing in your polls? Not quite said like that, but you know what I mean.
I will see what I can do.
Yes, I mean, I have to tell you that the planning of these polls has now become rather an interesting activity in the 4SD team. And it's great. And I'm very pleased that we're all tuning in to what happens in these briefings. I really love what's coming in the chat. And because, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind telling me who I might bring in, that would be good. And actually, Catherine, if you can switch on your mic and switch on your vid, because we're separate today, I wouldn't mind you also just being ready to be a bit of a master of ceremony. I'm going to throw one or two things at you.
No problem.
Okay, thank you, Kat. Could you just perhaps take us through the comment from Joe Nichols and perhaps have a bit of a discussion with Joe? Could you also talk with Gawaha about COVAX? I've got a bit of information about COVAX. I can also answer Gawaha's question. And then perhaps also, we all ought to chip in on what Annie Feltham has said. I'd quite like to see whether John could make any comment on what Annie has said. So Catherine first, please, if you could go with Joe's stuff.
Sure. So Joe, maybe you want to speak to this point. The question that you had, I understand, is about Israel and the comparison between vaccine rates and continued infections. By the way, hi, Joe.
Hi. Yes, I mean, I was reading in some papers yesterday just that there have been quite a lot of people vaccinated in Israel, kind of, 30 to 40%, but yet the numbers of people in hospital are not really declining. And certainly it seemed to be that it wasn't older people getting sicker, but it seemed to be that the numbers overall were still quite high. And I think people are watching Israel and the UK quite carefully. So I was wondering what that means for other people and for the vaccination campaign. And I mean, slightly related to that, I'm working on, I've been looking a lot at what countries in East Africa are doing, or Africa more broadly. And there's a sense that countries are being forced into signing things saying that they're not going to hold drugs companies accountable if anything goes wrong or if there are side effects. And it seems to be quite a popular response to say, well, we're not going to sign this, as a kind of assertion of independence and sovereignty. And I just wondered, you know, if it's not going obviously really well in the countries that have higher rates of vaccination, what the implications of that might be for the rest of the world.
Sorry about that. No, it's a really good question. I think the Israel question is maybe we speak to Israel in particular, and then the philosophical question more broadly in a second. So, you know, Israel does have a remarkably high vaccine rate. In part, that's because they've promised to provide data based on their vaccine programs back to the vaccine companies. And so they're receiving a reasonable supply. But it's important to remember that none of the vaccines that we're using right now are single dose vaccines, and they all have 2 or 3 weeks between the times that you're supposed to get one. And vaccines didn't start rolling out. I mean, it's only February 5th, right? So we've only had vaccines for 6 weeks. So we wouldn't expect to see a substantial decline in incidence yet. What we would expect to see, especially if they start vaccinating the most vulnerable, is a decline in death. So, you know, what we do see in Israel right now is that their overall incidence in the last 7 days, or the last, is it 7 days or no, last 14-day incidence is down 39%. So they are seeing a not insubstantial decrease 6 weeks in. But that also have to remember that Israel had one of the most sort of strict lockdowns over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks that may have changed things. But I don't think what we're seeing in terms of science or epidemiology is unusual. Now, how we message that, I think, is a very different question, right? Because everybody does want sort of instantaneous, you know, we're vaccinating like crazy. Let's have a lower incident rate, a higher protection. And I think we are going to have to be really careful about how we do that. And I'm not sure what to do, except as we were just saying to David, continue to tell the truth as best we can about the science that we know. And so we keep doing that and using that as the mechanism. And then the last thing you said that I thought was really interesting is this question of indemnification. Who's responsible for any kind of adverse effects? And I'll have just to mention that we had a nice conversation with the team that's at WHO, the COVAX focal team, Bruce. And we had a conversation with Bruce. You're Joe, you know Bruce. So we with Bruce Aylward. And you know, one of the things that he was mentioning was that one of the stickiest wickets in this whole process is the question of indemnification and how to build that into these agreements and how to manage that. So, and it is always the case in my experience as a lawyer that that's the first response is to not sign that as a matter of independence and autonomy. And the next response is to sign it eventually. So I think that what's gonna happen is that people will sign it eventually. Did that help? Is there? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I really hope so. I mean, what we're hearing back from various countries is that they're so reluctant to give up what they see as, you know, their right to say this didn't work and it's your fault. Yep. And you know, where that will go, I mean, maybe they'll sign it in the end, maybe some people won't. And I guess the countries that say there's no COVID will find it hard to sign that.
Well, and I think what's going to end up happening is that there will be a fund set up that will manage, you know, adverse effects and the impacts there. I don't want to, we have so many people that want to speak and there's only 15 minutes, so I want to be very careful. Gawahar, you were talking about the Canadian press. Do you want to tell us what you were saying?
Hi, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, David. Yeah, just very quickly, not to take up too much time. I read this morning and heard it on the radio that Canada is reaching into the COVAX pot. I was taken aback. I mean, for those of you living in Canada, you already know, but it's a big mess here, and the politicians in power are obviously trying to convince Canadians that we are going to get the vaccine in time, and the opposition is getting upset with them. Basically, I mean, we don't know what's going on. But when I heard that we would put our hand in the COVAX pot, I was really taken aback. I didn't imagine that would be a possibility. And why should we take vaccines from developing countries? So I don't know if you read or heard anything about that, and if that is a possibility, which.
So David will know more than I about this, I imagine, but my understanding of the way that COVAX is set up is that in terms of equity, there's an understanding that they would help every country in the world vaccinate 20% of their population. And that's every country in the world. And so that includes everybody. Now, I think the way you said it at the end is the best. Like, you know, you had sort of two parts of your question. One was, is that possible for them to access COVAX? And I think the answer is yes, because COVAX is set up as a global mechanism. And the second part of your question was, should they be accessing COVAX? And I think those are two very different questions, right? So should they be accessing a supply of vaccines that could be going to countries that have less access overall? I think David said it quite well a couple minutes ago. Just I agree with him wholeheartedly. I think we should be vaccinating people everywhere first before we vaccinate all the people in particular places. So the first answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no. If you were talking to me. But David, you'll definitely know more.
Thanks very much. I don't understand precisely what's going on, Gawaha, but what I've learned is that COVAX is a system for pooling the purchase of vaccines and trying to get them available for everybody at the lowest possible price. So it negotiates with the companies to do bulk purchase, and in doing so to get the price down. And that's always been the approach that the world has taken on vaccines. That's why we have outfits like the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, or Gavi, explicitly there to try to get, say, 50, 70, 80% plus reduction in the price. Now, it's actually better for the world if all countries get their vaccines through COVAX. As soon as countries start going around the side of COVAX and negotiating separate deals with companies, what that does is it leads to price instability and in some cases to price rises. So what we've been trying to do in WHO is to encourage all countries to use COVAX. Now, some of the COVAX member countries get the vaccine at cost, so they pay cash for it. And that's more than 100 countries. Some of the COVAX member countries, and it's a slightly smaller number, get their vaccines either at reduced price or free. Because built into the COVAX scheme is a special extra funding mechanism. It's an actual fund itself, which pays for the cost of vaccines for countries that are really poor and can't afford them for themselves. So you can be a COVAX member and access vaccines and pay for them, which is the Canada story, or you can be a COVAX member and access vaccines and somebody else pays for them, which is what happens if you're a really poor country. And the division as to which countries are in the paying for category and which countries are in the subsidized category is all based on the usual rules about who's a least developed country, who's a least developed country, who's a developing country, who's a middle income country, and so on. I hope that helps to just understand a little bit. If I see heads shaking, so I'll try once more. Overall, COVAX is a bulk purchase scheme for vaccines. And it's got advanced purchase arrangements on lots of different vaccines. It's designed to make it easy for anybody who wants to get a vaccine that works at a reasonable price. Some COVAX members are able to get vaccines from COVAX, but subsidized by donors or foundations because they are poor. And those countries get their COVAX vaccines paid for because they can't afford them. Canada's just going to COVAX to get vaccines, and Canada will pay for them the appropriate cost. But very poor countries, particularly conflict-affected countries and so on, they get their vaccines from COVAX, but they are subsidized by donors. I hope that's clear. And what I want to stress is countries getting vaccines through COVAX is really great, because the one thing that destabilizes the COVAX mechanism is if countries go round the side and do bilateral deals with the vaccine manufacturers. That then disturbs the whole pricing arrangements and can lead to the bumping up of the prices. It also leads to delays in vaccines coming to COVAX, because the companies end up supplying those who are paying 2 or 3 times the COVAX price for their vaccines. Happy to follow up with you directly if you're stuck on it, but just want to say, buying vaccines through COVAX is a good thing, whether you're a rich country or poor country. It helps to make certain that prices are stabilized. I'm going to go to Catherine. We've got a comment in from Annie, and I thought it'd be good if Annie could say it. Would you like just to bring Annie in? Thank you.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. I started off by saying one size does not fit all, but I think Lewis got it better when he said it's not a binary choice between being optimistic or realistic. I thought that was brilliant. What we've noticed is that's a super word. What's in our face in the UK at the moment is the damage that's been done to lockdown. And so therefore I'm talking about it in terms of some sort of social repair that we need to do as people have become very frail, locked away. And that actually will require some sort of positive action, which I think locally we can do. You were raising this thing again about being COVID ready. And here's my UK view on this. We can do jabs, and our scientists are doing a good job, and we're getting jabs in people's arms. And we can look after the NHS to some extent. I mean, it's under a lot of pressure. And we can do our own individual things, which is this physical distancing and all of that sort of stuff. And we've got some local action going. But the real hold-up remains the central system. And so in terms of having a centrally managed test and trace operation, or doing something about our borders, I think actually you can just forget it. We're no closer, and we've got the same sort of problems. So for me, I'm thinking about what's the balance between saying, yes, the jabs are a good thing. It does give us something to work on, and there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, but not expressing that in some sort of Pollyanna-ish way, which gives people completely realistic expectations. Because like others, I would be worried about sending you off to be, somebody else said it, a Cassandra-like figure. I think your dilemma is quite sophisticated, and it's actually how to strike the right balance.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad that you said that. It's not, and I mean, I was silly to present it as an either or. Of course, it's more sophisticated, and Annie, that's really, really helpful. I'm just going to be now, because this was presented as a binary choice, and the binary choice is clearly not helpful, I am going to just spend a moment or two on the chat because it's so rich today. Now, first of all, Sean Lowry says, ask difficult questions as a way to create an environment where facts are more likely to be heard. I like that. And I think that's a really, really helpful a suggestion, Sean. And I know that several of you commented. Louisa Nofke said she agreed. And Vicky wanted a link to the article. Then Lewis Thomas, who's doing clinical duty at the moment, so he can't talk, said the vaccines, it's worth saying that the vaccines are the greatest tool that we have to end this pandemic, and they represent a true light at the end of the tunnel. However, we don't know how long the tunnel is for a number of reasons, but together through collaboration, we can overcome the challenges. I think that's right. Now, one colleague who was talking to me, one of the experts in WHO, said, there's one problem with this light at the end of the tunnel metaphor. It's the question, are you sure those aren't the lights of a train coming towards you? And There is a bit of a chat among epidemiologists working on the Europe story that it might be just not quite as clear as it is. I'd like John to comment on some of the issues that we've got in the chat, and also on his own view of the analytical framing I did. John, would you like to come in now?
Thanks, David. I like this idea, David, of difficult questions, because when you're faced with a complex situation, as opposed to one that is simply complicated, there isn't actually an answer to it. And the way that we help evolve towards a better circumstance is by asking questions that push us in the right direction. So a good question to ask, listening to this, might be, okay, so when new variants emerge, do we now have a test and trace system that will find people who have them and enable us to isolate them quickly? Which is not saying, no, we haven't, which it puts you in the negative position, but it points us at the activities that we need to do. So that feels an important thing. Asking questions in complex situations is a way of evolving towards a more effective way of operating, because there isn't, frankly, a right answer. Nobody yet knows it, even if one could emerge over time. There was something also, though, that Annie put in the chat that touched me personally, which is this comment that, you know, as the elderly come out for their jabs, people saying how frail they look. One of the things I've noticed in my family is as my mother gets older and has dealt with some difficult circumstances over the last few months, her ability to connect to reality, to family history, to who we all are, is increasingly difficult for her, because we just don't see her. We just don't sit there and take time and reconfirm those loops and those stories that all families tell to each other as they go, you know, as relatives get older. So I think there are going to be many effects, even as the immediate impact of the disease starts to disappear or become less so, that we're going to have to live with for some time. And we're going to need to work out how we're going to do this. And my suspicion is some of these things will rectify themselves in due course, just through normal social interaction, but some of them may be with us for quite some time. And we need to not forget that if we find ourselves in an environment where, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to get around a bit better and all the rest of it, seems somehow like it's all gone away. So I think we've got plenty more to think about as we go forward.
Now, everybody, it's about 5 o'clock. I'm just going to finish commenting on one or two things in the chat, and then I have to close. And I've got one remark to say before we finish. I think I want to really stress that Canada contributing to COVAX is brilliant, and I really want to give a shout out to the International Development Minister of Canada, who's just absolutely fabulous and who's been consistent and clear on this issue right throughout. I'd like to stress that COVAX is a device through which, by doing bulk purchasing, the purchaser can get the price down. So it's a good mechanism for bundling together countries' needs. Within COVAX, there's a system for subsidy of those countries that are too poor to be able to buy a vaccine. Linked to COVAX, there's a program to help countries develop their own national vaccination programs. That's now operating in more than 90 countries. And COVAX will work. We've got to talk about it more. We've got to make sure everybody realizes this is the right way to go and not present it as just a sort of charity for the poor, which is a little bit how it's being presented in newspapers in 1 or 2 countries. And let's move ahead and see how that goes. Now, to where I am and where I think we're going to go. Yes, I'm going to do what you've all suggested, hybrid, optimism, because I am inherently an optimist, but also realism, because I don't like people sort of imagining that things are just going to beautifully get better without lots of hard work. But at the same time, I am going to use the asking the tough questions approach, which you've suggested and which I find very attractive. A little bit now about these briefings. I want to go on doing them, and I will go on doing them, but I want to tell you that I'm finding my COVID work more and more difficult as the months go by. Reasoning, The issues are more challenging. Answers to each of the questions I'm dealing with are tough. There are no simple answers. And the extent of political investment in the different choices that can be made is huge. There's such polarization in different countries that makes navigating forward difficult, because so many livelihoods are being lost, so many businesses are going under. And I want to go on doing this. The briefings will be a mix of the facts as I know them, but also sharing with you sometimes the challenges that we are facing with our media work or with our briefing work. And what we've done today is really take you right into the heart of one of the challenges we face. TWE will keep the group going, and what we want to do is to make that a very lively group, the group, LinkedIn group, and that LinkedIn group is actually becoming a central support service for us as we move forward. We are viewing you as a constituency that feeds us and that helps us to work through difficult issues. Our whole COVID group joins these briefings. John, Catherine, Flo, TWE, Will Ramsey, who's on, my brother William, who joins us and helps us. We're all on because we want to hear what you think. You're our kind of focus group. You're our kind of brains trust. You're our trusted friends. You are also very, very kind and generous to us. And we want to keep that going. We would like, as much as you want it to continue to be sharing and exchanging, especially some of the tough questions. And when I read, particularly some of the really, really valuable pieces of advice from some of you who know what you're talking about so well, it's really helpful. And so we just finished by just looking at what Will Ramsey said. Is there a moral imperative to explain COVID in a way that doesn't impact the emotionally and mentally fragile, so that they are not either, I'm embellishing your question, either pushed into a state of extreme anxiety and depression, or nudged towards fake news, conspiracy theories, and the like? I want us to leave this briefing today with that question in our minds. Is there a moral imperative on how we should explain this? I'm super interested in that, because I'm watching lots and lots of different experts come along and give patterns of advice, sometimes shock horror, sometimes super optimistic, sometimes blending. To what extent do those of us who are trying to communicate about this see that we have a moral imperative, and are we reflecting that right? Now, there were reactions to Will's questions from several of you. Saw Joe Nichols writing. Will, you're going to have the last word. What do you feel about that? You didn't answer the question yourself. Could you answer it, please? Thank you.
So the question, thank you, David. So the question came from the fact that I have an acquaintance of several years who, in any other sort of situation, you know, if we were living in normal times as opposed to these interesting ones in which we find ourselves, you would imagine that she was sort of relatively on a level and quite sort of capable of dealing with whatever life threw at her in a cogent and sort of nominally normal fashion. It seems to be the case, however, following lockdown and perhaps isolation and a level of anxiety, that she's walking along, sort of gently stumbling into this realm more and more of funny extremist social media posts, which are based, I was talking to TWE about it earlier, on sort of 2% fact, which then lead, you know, to a sort of premise being established that this is real. And then everything that follows, therefore, being sort of ontologically connected and by default also real. And I've just found it rather worrisome. And is there this moral imperative somehow, and I don't know what the answer is, to ensure that in our communications with people, so we are holding their hands and, you know, providing that level of comfort and reassurance in our thinking towards them, because I don't know the best way of dealing with this, fake news problem that we see.
Well, that's a very helpful piece of guidance, Will, because holding hands, but you can't obviously trying to do it across the television or across Zoom, is really where I would like to try to be, to help people to make sense of what's happening and to share with them what I know and what I suspect, but to do it in a way that connects with them. So that's going to be my leitmotif for the week. I will try it the weekend. I can't promise I'll end up on the telly, but I will do so. Now, Sally, could you put up your illustration? Loy Rago has asked. And everybody, I want to thank all of you for the comments in the chat. I particularly want to thank my brother William, whose remarks I've been reading out on 2 or 3 occasions. Sally, how have you felt about all this? It looks lovely.
Hi, David. Long time
Hello.
no see. Nice to be back again.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Here is the scribing from today. As always, I like to say that I do not feel qualified at all, but the general feeling is that the messaging is always a tricky thing to get right, and it is all about the balance of optimism and realism, that the future looks bright and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but are they the lights of an oncoming train? And because there is a 3 to 4 week lag in figures, to not rest on your flat curve because it will turn into a spike. Do not stop doing the basics, and a discussion about COVAX and the equity for vaccines, and that all countries should use COVAX because it will stabilize the prices. And there is no binary choice, and that everything is in balance.
Sally, we thank you. We honestly, you are so generous, all of you at Live Illustration. Everybody who's joined, thank you for your time and for really a most enriching and for me enlightening conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it. See those of you who can join next week and connect with some of you in the meantime. Twee, is there anything else we need to say? Over to you.
Next week, see you here. It will be the morning session, European time. So hopefully you can join us then.
Come and join us for Zoom fun, or join the Tunnel Club, whatever you want to call it. Actually, the Tunnel Club may not quite work, but we can play. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Oh, there's all the... there's Zara. There's Polly with Otto. I can see Otto. Thank you, Polly. Thank you, Otto. Gorgeous, my fun moment.